Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a new micro handheld. This one is called the XU Mini M. And we've seen quite a few of these budget micro handhelds released over the past year, and I'm a big fan of them. I like the fact that they are super pocketable, but then also they don't break the bank. Usually you can find them for under $50. And this one that we're reviewing today actually has quite a lot of good things going for it. In fact, compared to some of its contemporaries, there are some aspects to this that are better than the others, including its analog sticks, the ergonomics, as well as the screen. But there are a couple components of this device that are worse than the others, and so in addition to doing just a full-on review of this device, we'll do a comparison against other micro handhelds as well. Either way, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by talking about the specs. So this is using a new chipset that we haven't seen in handhelds before. This is the Rockchip RK3562, and this is actually a fairly powerful chipset, especially at this price point. There are not a lot of benchmarks out there in the wild, but I have found that the performance is about on par with the RK3566. And that's a chipset that you will find in devices that are usually around the $100 price point. Now, one thing worth noting is that I just saw a note that was written, I think by the company just yesterday, that said that they are thinking about moving over to a new chipset manufacturer. And so it may be that the XU Mini M will be sold with a different chipset sometime in the future. Either way, let's continue going over the specs as we have them right now. So let's talk about the screen. This is 2.8 inches, much like a lot of the other micro handhelds on the market, and it has a 4:3 aspect ratio and a resolution of 640 by 480, so nothing special there. It has a 2600 milliamp hour battery, which again is about on par with other handhelds, and over the past few days of testing I got between 4 and 6 hours of battery life depending on how far I was pushing it. In terms of connectivity, this is an offline device, so it doesn't have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but you could use a USB dongle for wireless connectivity. And then finally, it does have some other standard features, including stereo speakers and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, in terms of pricing, I've seen it go anywhere between $40 and $50. I picked mine up for $50 about a month ago. And as far as I can tell, we've got 3 different colors to choose from. We have a black model, an orange model, and then the gray one that I have. However, I would argue that my gray model is closer to a tan than gray. Right now, I found the cheapest place to get it is AliExpress, which is where I got mine, but you can also find it with third-party retailers like Keep Retro as well. Okay, let's start with an unboxing, and mine came with a hard shell case. It actually has the name of the store that I bought it from right here. Now, I'm not sure if this is just the distributor or they're involved in the manufacturing process, but I have seen that other hard shell cases from other stores still have this store name on it. Either way, it's a pretty nice hard shell case. It reminds me of the one that came with the Miu A30. Now inside we obviously have the device, but then a couple other goodies as well. So we have a USB-A to USB-C charging cable, so no surprise there. And it also comes with a silicone lanyard if you want to use that with your device. I will say that the plastic or the silicone feel here is a little bit tacky, and I bet that over time it'll get a little sticky too. So definitely not the highest quality lanyard that I've seen. If you want something like this, you might be better off getting your own. In addition, we've got a screen protector, always happy to see those, and then we have an instruction manual, and this will walk you through some of the hotkeys as well as the diagram of the different buttons. In addition, underneath the device itself, it actually has the website for their stock firmware. So if you don't get a card or if your card gets broken, you can pick it up right here. Now let's talk about my first impressions with the handheld itself, and number one is the fact that it is just a really cute looking handheld. I think all of the buttons and everything are just proportioned correctly. It has a nice rounded look to it, and I think it's good in terms of thickness as well. It just is a very inviting shape. And my second impression was that the feel of the plastic is not the best. It's a little bit on the cheap side. It has a little bit of a grippy texture to it, but not much. I would say it's more slick than anything. And so it does feel a little bit on the cheap side just in my first impressions. And so next I want to move in and directly start talking about some of the controls. And the first things that I really noticed were the shoulder buttons. Now these are in line, which is very similar to other pocketable devices, but the thing that I noticed most is that the shoulder buttons are kind of hard to press down on. They do have a micro switchy connection to them. You can hear that they are kind of loud, but the thing I don't like is that pressing on the outside right here doesn't actually actuate the button unless you push it really far down. And so it ends up being that you have to press it exactly right here in order for it to work. And so it might take some time to retrain your fingers and only push it up here, because if you try to push it from here, you're not going to have a great time. Now, thankfully, the trigger buttons are a lot easier to press down on. They also are kind of clicky and micro switchy, but still not too bad. Also up top, we have 2 USB-C ports, one for charging, another for peripherals, and then we have our volume up and down. On the bottom, we have down-firing stereo speakers, then we have our power button and reset button, and then our headphone jack. On the left side, we have an SD card slot with our operating system, and mine came with a 64GB generic card. We've also got a couple holes for the lanyard here in the back left. On the right, all we have is an SD card slot. This can be used for expanding storage with games. And not a lot going on the back other than an exhaust vent for the CPU. Now let's move on to the front and talk about the controls, starting with the D-pad. So this is a rubber membrane connection, exactly what you probably would expect from a micro handheld like this. The D-pad's a little bit on the small side, which is kind of expected with a small handheld, and it does have a nice tactile feel to it. In fact, the travel here is just about perfect. I feel like it just presses down really well. However, it does feel like the pivot is a little bit awkward. It's kind of smushy more than anything. So let's go ahead and put it into practice and see how this D-pad really behaves. We'll start with the contour test. Here I'm going to push down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And unfortunately, as you can see, there is basically no movement whatsoever. I think this has to do with that lack of pivot, because no matter how far I try to move it left or right, the character does not move at all. And what this means is we're not going to have accidental diagonals. So when I move the character around and I try to duck down, I'm not going to accidentally go to a diagonal instead. And so that works out pretty well in games like Contra when you don't want to do a diagonal on accident. However, the big negative here is that it's hard to press a diagonal. No matter how hard I push it, it's actually pretty hard to pull one off. And so even though it's great that I'm not hitting a diagonal accidentally, it's still kind of a bummer because I wouldn't really want to play Contra on this device. And so I feel if that little plastic piece in the center of the D-pad was just a little bit longer, we would have a better pivot and easier diagonals. So now let's try out a game that relies on diagonal inputs. Let's do Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And unfortunately, this is as bad as I was fearing it would be. It is really hard to throw a fireball, a hurricane kick, or even a dragon punch. If I really mash down the controller and then I time it just perfectly, sometimes the move will happen, but for the most part, I would say this is not Hadoukenable, nor is it Shoryukenable. So I think in particular, if you're trying to play any sort of game that relies on diagonals, this is not going to be an excellent fit. But thankfully, there are a ton of different games that don't really require diagonal inputs at all. So something like Sonic the Hedgehog or even the older Super Mario Bros. Games, they didn't really use diagonals. And so this is going to be still a really great experience. It's really going to come down to those games that rely on a diagonal input. And so I would say from a D-pad perspective, you'll probably have to pick and choose which games play the best. But for the games that do, it's great. And for the games that don't, it's kind of a pain. And when it comes to D-pad-centric games that rely more on a 360-degree motion, you could probably use your analog stick instead. I know it's kind of blasphemy for games like on the Super Nintendo, but still it works out pretty well. Speaking of which, let's talk about these analog sticks because they are very surprising. First of all, they are Hall sensor sticks, and this is easily the cheapest device I've seen with Hall sensor sticks on them. In addition, the overall feel and range of motion is actually pretty great. Instead of flopping from left to right like a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con controller, it actually has a really nice range of motion. It actually feels like the analog sticks on a Retroid Pocket device or even the Odin. However, I don't think they're the same because the caps themselves do not pull off like they do on the other devices. In terms of overall feel, I think they are pretty good. The only complaint I would have is that they don't stick out quite as much as I would like them to. My guess is they decided to do this to make sure the device was as pocketable as possible, but I would have loved just a couple more millimeters because sometimes when you're pushing down on it, it feels like it's flush with the case, and that doesn't feel very good. And so if we did have just a little bit more height here at the expense of pocketability, I think it would have been a better experience. Now in terms of controls, it's actually pretty good. We get a full range of motion here. There's a little bit of cardinal snapping, but not that much. In fact, this is quite better than what you would find like on an Anbernic device, for example. And so I think that the calibration and tuning of these analog sticks is actually pretty darn good. And it is surprising that we're getting this high quality of analog sticks on a $40 to $50 device. Also of note, they do click down L3 and R3. When it comes down to it, I think these are probably some of the best analog sticks that I've found in a small and cheaper handheld. If they were just a little bit taller, I would say this is a perfect gameplay experience. Okay, moving on, let's talk about these face buttons. These are also a rubber membrane connection, so much like the D-pad, and they feel pretty good. They're nice and responsive, they don't bottom out or anything, and so I don't have many complaints about the feel of the buttons. I also like the coloring of these A, B, and XY buttons. They're a little bit muted or pastel, and so I think it just separates them from other devices on the market. The only complaint I have about these buttons is that they're a little bit sharp on each side. You can see here that they're not quite as rounded as they could be. It's not quite to the point where I find it to be uncomfortable, but I think it would have been better if they were more rounded. But overall, I think they're good buttons, and they're nice and quiet too. Now, next up we have our start and select buttons. These are micro switch connections, and they are a little bit on the loud side, but not too bad. And then finally, the last button here is going to be our menu button, which is down here below the screen, and it's labeled with the letter G. It is a little bit odd that it's there, but I actually think this is a better placement than trying to throw it up top, and so I don't really mind it. And then finally, the last thing on the front is this LED light, and I actually really like this. This light is nice and muted, so it's nice in a dark environment, and it'll light up when the device is turned on. Right now it's in sleep mode, that's why you can see it as blue, but if I was to turn the device back on, you can see that, yeah, it'll stay blue as well. And when charging it, it'll turn into a red or a purplish color, and I think that looks really good too. So I do really like the fact that the LED is not bright at all. It's really nice looking. Okay, so now let's talk about just overall ergonomics as well as the size. And I think that overall it's a really comfortable handheld. It's just nice and rounded and symmetrical, and I like the amount of roundedness we have on each end because it just feels really comfortable. And I think the fact that it's a little bit on the thick side actually makes it more comfortable to use. Yeah, it's going to stick out in your pocket a little bit more, but you know, when you're actually playing it, it's a lot more comfortable, and I would rather have that. And let's do a couple size comparisons so you can get an idea of just how big it is. To start, here is the Game Boy Micro. You can see that this one is quite a bit smaller than the Mini M. Now, one micro device that's of a similar size is this one here. This is the TrimUI Smart. And throughout all of last year, this was my favorite micro handheld, but we didn't have a lot of choice back then. This one has a 2.4-inch screen, which feels a lot smaller than the 2.8-inch screen on the one we're reviewing today. Next up is the Miu A30. This one came out earlier this year and also has a 2.8-inch screen. And when you look at them head on, they are about the same size, but I would say that this one is quite a bit smaller and then also a lot blockier as well. And so even though this one is nice and compact and quite comfortable to use, I find myself preferring the Mini M in terms of ergonomics. In addition, one of my least favorite things about the A30 is that it gets pretty hot when you're playing, and I think that has to do with how thin the device is. That's not really as big of an issue with the Mini M because it is thicker. Okay, next up is Anbernic's latest small handheld. This is the RG28XX. The 2.8 stands for 2.8 inches, and so it's the exact same screen size as the other. This one is also very thin and compact, but not quite as comfortable as this one either. There are a couple other things worth comparing with this one as well, which we'll do later in this video. Another device worth comparing with is the original Miu Mini. Even though this one is a vertical handheld, it does have a 2.8-inch screen as well. And you can see that the gameplay experience is totally different on a vertical handheld like this, which feels super small and cramped, as opposed to a nice horizontal experience like this. Another thing worth noting is that the size difference between the Mini M and a 3.5-inch display like this one on the RG35XXH is really not that far off. We are looking at something about a ½ inch of difference between the two, and so this one is still very pocketable, but it is going to give you quite a bit bigger of a screen by comparison. So I would say among all the micro-based handhelds, this one is getting the closest to just a full-on 3.5-inch device instead. But don't get me wrong, it's still a very small handheld. Here it is compared to the Steam Deck OLED. At the end of the day, I think it's a really good shape and size for a smaller handheld as long as you don't mind having a 2.8-inch screen. I know for a lot of people this is just too small, but I think when it comes to pocketability, this is a really good balance. As a good example, yesterday I took the day off from the channel and I went and just had a family day. So we did a bunch of chores, went out to eat, and then also caught my son's vocal recital. And throughout that entire time, I brought the XU Mini M with me. I didn't really play it that much other than, sometimes when we were in the car, but the big point about it was that I was able to keep it in my pocket and it really didn't bother me at all the entire time. And that's one of the big benefits of having a micro handheld, something that you can just throw into your pocket and then just pull it out when you need it. And that's usually not something you can do with a larger handheld. So I think just in terms of having a nice micro handheld that you can carry around town, the XU Mini M definitely fits that bill. And another reason why I think this is actually a very good device to take around on the go is the fact that the screen gets very, very bright. In fact, in all of my normal testing, I kept the brightness between 15 and 20%. This is a really bright screen. If I crank it up to 100%, I can use it outdoors with absolutely no problem. And it's also very interesting because many of the other micro handhelds are a lot dimmer than I would like them to be. And so this one is like twice as bright as the others. It's really great. So if you are looking for something that's a little bit more versatile and that you can take it around in different environments, then the XU Mini M really fits that bill. So now let's talk about the operating system and software that comes with the device. And this is really interesting. It's using AmberELEC. This is a custom operating system that was made several years back, and it's been pared down specifically for this chipset. And unfortunately, they've stripped out a lot of your options. For example, if you press the start button, you can't do anything. You can press this guide button and it'll actually bring up the ability to restart the device or shut it down. But that's all you have in terms of main menu options. Now, if you go inside of a device and actually go through the menu, you can now press the G button and this will bring up the regular main menu options. However, even here, the options are very truncated. For example, under emulator options, you can pick just a couple different things. So for example, here you can see with Game Boy Color, I've already set my specific RetroArch core as well as the aspect ratio, and then I've also set up a shader. So we do have a couple different options to choose from, but it's not as robust as it is on other custom firmwares. Now in the controller settings section, we can go and remap our buttons, but again, we don't have a lot of options here. And same thing with the UI settings, we don't have the ability to change themes or anything. The game collection settings have also been pared down. All you can really do here is just toggle on and off which systems you want to display. Now under language settings, we have quite a few options, always nice to see that. And then under the TF card management, you can decide which cards you want to actually pull the ROMs from, either the SD1 card or the SD2. And then finally, under system settings, we can adjust the brightness, and that is about it. So really when it comes down to it, we don't have a lot of options here. You can just basically choose your system, choose your game, and then boot it up with a couple different options within the menu settings, but not that much. Now, in terms of just the overall game library that comes on this 64GB card, there are a lot of options here. In fact, there are thousands of games available. And so chances are, if you're looking for a plug-and-play system just to be able to grab your games and go, this has most of the games that you might be looking for. And unlike other manufacturers who have been taking out a lot of Nintendo IP from their cards, it doesn't seem like they've changed any of that here. So you can find all your Mario games, all your Zelda games, Pokemon, they're all going to be found within this device. Now, once you start up a game, you will also find that the options are very limited. We can press the menu button and it's going to give us a very truncated RetroArch quick menu. So here we can go back to our game, we can restart it, we can also go and save and load a save state. And it also has some preloaded cheats, and really that's about it. You can then exit out of the game, but you cannot get into RetroArch and you cannot make any other changes. And so if you want to do things like overlays or even access retro achievements, unfortunately you have no access here with this firmware. And like I said, that could be a good or a bad thing depending on the type of gameplay that you want. If you just want to be able to get into your games, this is going to work just fine. And it does have some very basic functions like the ability to do a save state or just to exit out of your game. But for me personally, I do like to be able to tinker a little bit more with these handhelds, and thankfully there already is a custom firmware option, so let's dive into that. And this operating system is called PlumOS, and essentially it's just Amber Elect that's been restored, so you have all of your options again. So for example here, if I press the start button, I have the full range of options here. Let's just go into system settings, you can see exactly what I mean. Here I can set up things like my time zone, my brightness, and change just a bunch of other options. And same thing under the game settings, we have the full suite of motions here, not only for the system overall, but then also we can do per system settings too. In addition, the PlumOS supports Wi-Fi dongles, and so we can just plug this in, connect to our Wi-Fi, get things like retro achievements, and it actually comes pre-built with Portmaster as well. So if you wanted to download ports and play it on this device, or if you wanted to use native Pico 8, you could do that as well. Not only that, we've got full access to RetroArch, including the 64 and 32-bit versions. And so this means that we can set up things like hotkeys or special overlays, whatever you would like. Here's a good example here. I've got a Game Boy Advance overlay, which shows a little Game Boy Advance logo, but then also it has a grid overlay, and then I've combined that with a sharp bilinear shader. And you can find these overlays within the RetroArch quick menu. Just go into on-screen overlay, and then under overlay preset, you've got a bunch of different options you can choose from. And so that's one of the things I really like about having Amber Elect, is that I can customize my experience on a per system or even a per game level. And it's pretty amazing that with a brand new device, we have such a robust option already. Now, that being said, I wouldn't say that PlumOS or Amber Elect are a perfect fit for a micro handheld. And that's because even though the device does support sleep, if we press the power button, it'll go to sleep, and then we can press it again to wake it back up, it doesn't have like quick shutdown or auto resume. And with other custom operating systems that are out there with more recent devices like MinUI and MuOS as well as Newly, all of these have quick shutdown features and many of them have auto resume as well. And that's really important with micro handhelds because these are the ones you're going to be taking around town, which means you're going to turn them off really quickly and then you want to resume your game. The sleep function will work, but it will also drain the battery more than an auto resume will. So I think there are a couple things software-wise that could be better with PlumOS, specifically with a micro handheld, but it's still way better than the stock experience, so I'm happy to see it. So now let's move into gameplay experience and just talk about each system. We'll start with the lightweight stuff like Game Boy and then work our way up from there. And so I think just overall in terms of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color experience, yeah, this is going to be a great time. Another nice thing about PlumOS and Amber Elect in general is that you can make a lot of RetroArch configurations just here within the advanced system settings. You press the select button and then go into here, and now we can make a bunch of adjustments that you generally would have to do within RetroArch. So I can set up my shaders as well as my aspect ratio right here. And so it is nice to be able to make some of these configuration changes without getting a PhD in RetroArch. Moving along, Game Boy Advance is a really good experience too. You're not going to get like pixel perfect integer scaling, but it still looks pretty good if you use enough shaders. And so as long as you don't mind the relatively smaller screen, I think this will be a really good Game Boy Advance machine as well. When it comes to 8-bit and 16-bit systems, things like NES, Master System, Genesis, Super Nintendo, all of that, these are all going to work really well. And because it's a 4:3 display, that does mean that they're all going to scale really well. And in terms of performance, all these are going to play really well with no additional hacks or anything. Even the hardest to play Super Nintendo games like Yoshi's Island, absolutely fine. While we're here, let's go ahead and do a quick audio test. We're going to play Streets of Rage 2 on Sega Genesis at full volume. Okay, I would say the audio here is pretty good, all things considered, at this price point. It certainly gets very loud, and I can hear all the distinct parts. It does lack in some bass, but that is expected with a small handheld as well. What really sets it apart is this is one of the only micro handhelds that has stereo speakers. And personally, I really like that stereo sound, and so this is a big plus for me. Now let's move on to more performance-minded systems. We'll start with PlayStation 1 and then work our way up from here. And I found that PS1 is absolutely no problem. Every single game I tried played at full speed, so this is probably going to be your performance cap right here. And that's of no surprise because most of these other systems will cap out at PS1 as well. Now, the Nintendo 64 experience is a little bit mixed. It's going to use the standalone version of Mupen, but as you can see, the lighting effects are going to be a little bit off. And so even though the performance is going to be best with the standalone version, you're not going to be able to see the frames per second to see whether or not you're getting full speed, and some of the games are going to look a little bit wonky. And even though the analog sticks here are really precise and they feel good, I really can't get over the fact that they're just a little bit too low seated in the case. You could probably try to fix that by putting a cap on the analog stick, but I think that might inhibit your movement as well. So it is a bit of a disappointing experience in the fact that I can finally play Super Mario 64 with excellent controls on a micro handheld, but at the same time it doesn't feel as good as it could be because these sticks are so low. So overall, I would say the Nintendo 64 experience is a little bit compromised right out of the gate. Not only is the lighting off in a lot of these games, but then also the controls just are not perfect. And when it comes to playing more heavyweight titles, things like Cruisin' USA, these still do not play at full speed. And so unfortunately, I would say don't buy this device if you're looking specifically to play a lot of Nintendo 64 because you'll probably be disappointed. Now, Sega Dreamcast is very similar as well. It has the standalone Flycast core, and so that's what's going to be running, and it does feel pretty great. Like, I actually get full speed here. It's just unfortunate that we cannot see the frames per second to see how much frame skip is actually happening. Another thing that's weird is the A, B, and XY mapping on PlumOS is reversed with the standalone emulator. So the A button is actually the A button, when on the Dreamcast, the A button was down below. So depending on the game that you're playing, this can be a very awkward experience, but at the very least, some of these games are going to play really well. When it comes down to it, along with Nintendo 64, this is a compromised experience and something that might get fixed with optimizations later on. At the very least, it is pretty clear that the Dreamcast performance here is better than on Nintendo 64, and so I would say this is still going to be a pretty good gameplay experience, all things considered. And I think if the custom firmware developers are able to fix the button configuration, it's going to be an even better experience. Bear in mind that it's still very early in the whole PlumOS development cycle, and so I'm not surprised to see that there are a couple bugs here or there. At the very least, I think we have enough raw performance power that I can easily say that the performance will get better on this chipset as long as we get more development and optimizations in the future. Now, one pleasant surprise was Sega Saturn. Even though I wouldn't really consider this to be playable with most games, it's still a lot further along than other micro handhelds. And it's crazy that these games are as close to being as playable as they are with only a $40 handheld. So when it comes down to it, I wouldn't really expect to play some of the more heavy-hitting games, things like Panzer Dragoon, but I think if you have a lightweight or 2D-based Saturn game, it'll probably play pretty well. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to PSP, the experience is quite a bit worse, depending on which firmware you're using. If we go back to the stock operating system, there are quite a few games that will play okay. But you have to also bear in mind that there is no way to get into the PSP menu to be able to change things like frame skip or anything else. For example, with God of War Chains of Olympus, you can see that the game is running at least what appears to be full speed, but also if you look at the gameplay footage, you can see there's obviously some frame skipping going on as well. So I would say if you are trying to play PSP well, it's not going to be a good experience on the stock firmware. Now, unfortunately, it was a really unpredictable experience when trying to play PSP on PlumOS. And that's because just using these standard default settings, the games would freeze a bunch, to the point where every single game I tried was unplayable. However, if you turn on the skip buffer effects option, the games will get a lot better. In fact, many games will play at full speed. Even Ridge Racer does a pretty decent job. There's definitely some slowdown, and I wouldn't consider this to be playable, but it is pretty darn close. But you also have to bear in mind that the skip buffer effects setting is not going to be great with many games. Ridge Racer is one of the few that really benefits from it. A lot of other games are just going to have graphical issues, and so in general, PSP just doesn't seem to be working very well. And I assume this has to do with optimizations with this chipset and Amber Elect, just because they were never meant to work together. The fact that we can even get Amber Elect to work on this chipset is kind of a miracle, and so I'm not super surprised that PSP still has a lot of work to get up to full speed. Again, much like with Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, it may be that there are optimizations that can improve this experience. But as it stands right now, again, I would not recommend picking up this device for these higher end systems. And it does appear that the company is aware of these performance limitations, because even in their Discord chats, they are mentioning that they're working on a new version of this device. Apparently, they're going to be calling it the Mini M Plus, and it's going to have an all-winner chip instead. And of course, I'll try to share as much information as I can as I get it in the future. And so long story short, even though this device has the most performance power, when it comes to optimizations and stability, I would say it's probably one of the worst, just because these emulators don't seem to be working very well. Okay, so that's a quick look at performance testing. I didn't dive too far into it just because the custom firmware options are still very limited and kind of preliminary. In addition, because it looks like we'll be getting a new chipset on this device in the future, it's hard to say whether or not any community developers are even going to try to optimize this machine. And so this may end up being a slice in time kind of device, and if so, this is the type of experience that you will get in terms of performance. At the very least, everything up to PS1 is going to play great, and I think those are probably the systems you'll play the most on a small handheld anyway. And so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MagicX XU Mini M. As always, we'll start with what I like, and I think number one here is the overall shape and size of this micro handheld. In fact, in terms of just overall comfort and pocketability, this is probably the best mix that I've seen so far. I was really surprised at how much I liked the ergonomics here. I was expecting this to just be a cheap throwaway handheld, but it really is up there in terms of some of the best micro handhelds that I've tested before. One of the things that really makes the ergonomics good is that it's nice and thick, and that has another added benefit in that the device does not get very warm. I think because we have more space internally, that means that we're just not getting a lot of heat directly onto your hands. I also think this is probably the best 2.8-inch screen that I've seen on a micro device. It gets ridiculously bright, and I think that the colors are nice and balanced as well. And I think if you combine that with its overall pocketability and ergonomics, this makes it a really good travel handheld. I also really like the analog sticks. Again, they are some of the best that I've tried in something at this price point. My only concern is that I wish that they stuck out a little bit more from the case to make them more comfortable. And then finally, if you're really focusing on retro-based systems, all the way up to PS1 with a 4:3 aspect ratio, that's where this device really shines. And I've enjoyed this thing the most when playing those systems. Things like Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Sega Genesis, these are all really great. However, some of these also bleed into my dislikes, so let's talk about those. To start, it is pretty darn hard to hit a diagonal with this D-pad. In all other cases, it's really great, but it is lacking pivot, and so if you are playing a game where you need to move from one direction to the other, it can get pretty bad. And for me, it is a bummer because I've had to pick and choose which games will work best with this handheld. I also am not a fan of these shoulder buttons. They are clicky and loud and hard to press down on the edges. It does make this device overall feel very cheap. It almost feels like I'm playing a device from 2021 instead of 2024. In addition, the software just in general needs work. Number one, the stock firmware is really locked down, and even though it is awesome that we already have some custom firmware for it, it's still very much in early stages. And so I do think this is one of those things that would probably take time and additional development effort to really optimize this device for these systems. And that leads into my final point in that this kind of feels like a limbo device. For all intents and purposes, it is still a very brand new handheld, but the company is already saying that they're going to replace it soon. And not only that, the replacement is going to have a new chipset, which means that any development work right now is only going to be for a very limited amount of handhelds. So unless they plan on offering these two devices concurrently, both the old chipset and the new, I don't expect the Mini M to be more than a flash in the pan. And so we are left in a bit of a weird predicament in that, yes, this device is really good from the start, but it does need software work. But I think that a lot of developers are going to be disincentivized now. So you might be wondering whether or not this device on its own is worth picking up. And it's hard to decide because there are so many options on the market right now. And I think that your main competitors are going to be these three devices, the Handheld RG28XX, the Mio A30, and then the TrimUI Smart. And each of these are around the similar price point. Usually you can find them for $50 or less. The thing is that none of these are perfect, so let's do a quick comparison against them to show their strengths and weaknesses. And so here's a quick, very subjective chart that I made just based on my own experience with these handhelds. And in general, I'm going to put them in 4 different categories. We have the best, then great, then okay, and then worst. And bear in mind that these rankings are not exclusive other than the best and worst categories, so you can have several that are going to be okay or great. So let's have a look at the D-pad as an example. I have found that the XUI Mini M is the worst D-pad just because of those diagonal issues, and I would consider the RG28XX to be the best. It's a little bit on the small side, but it actually works really well. It has a ton of pivot and it passes all my tests. Meanwhile, I would say the A30 is just okay. It's a little bit too sensitive for me, although some of the newer models I've heard are getting better. And I would say the TrimUI Smart also has a good D-pad. It is nice and clicky, but I do prefer a rubber membrane. Now, when it comes to face buttons, it's a mixed bag. I would say the A30 is the best, but the RG28XX is the worst because those buttons are so small. Again, the TrimUI Smart has clicky buttons which feel really great, and the XU Mini M are also very good, but the buttons themselves are a little bit on the sharp side at the edges. Moving on, I really like the analog sticks on the Mini M, and the A30 has Nintendo Switch style sticks, and those work okay. And then of course the 28XX and the TrimUI Smart just don't have analog sticks at all. When it comes to shoulders and triggers, I found that the Mini M are the worst just because they are so loud and the shoulders themselves are hard to press down on. The Mio A30s are probably the best. They are nice and soft, easy to press down on, and are not super loud. Meanwhile, the RG28XX does have loud, clicky buttons, which I kind of don't like. And then the TrimUI Smart lacks the L2 and R2 buttons, and so that can be a pain when it comes to certain PS2 games. Now, in terms of ergonomics, like we showed throughout the video, I think the Mini M is the best. After that, I would say the TrimUI Smart is the next best because it's nice and rounded, and I would say the other two devices are just okay. Now, when it comes to screen, the Mini M is best again because it's super bright and has really nice colors. The 28XX is also a good screen, but it doesn't get quite as bright. On the other hand, I would say the A30 is even more dim, to the point where I think it's too dim in many cases. And then finally, the TrimUI Smart I would consider to be the worst among them because it's a lot smaller. It's only 2.4 inches. Now, in terms of performance, this one is a little bit tricky just because we don't really know the full performance potential of the Mini M just yet. But I would say that it's about on par with the RG28XX, but just a lot less stable. Meanwhile, the A30 has been optimized pretty closely, but it still struggles with most Nintendo 64 games. And then of course the TrimUI Smart only plays up to PS1, and even then a couple games will struggle. So this one definitely has the worst performance. Now when it comes to audio, I would say that the XU Mini M is the best, just by virtue of having stereo speakers. All the others I would consider to be okay by comparison just because it does have that mono sound. When it comes to the quality itself, they're all about the same. They are a little bit tinny and lack bass, but again, these are very small handhelds. Now, in terms of software options, I would say that the RG28XX is the best. And that's because there has been a lot of development work on other XX devices, and the 28XX can benefit from that. And so we've got like half a dozen different software options for this handheld alone. Now, both the Mio A30 and TrimUI Smart can use an operating system called MinUI. And I think it works really well with micro handhelds because it allows you to do that quick save and shut down and resume function. In addition, there is an operating system called PlumOS on the Mio A30, and that can expand the operability of this handheld as well. Meanwhile, the software options on the Mini M are great for a handheld that just came out. But compared to the others, it's just okay. We have the stock operating system and then another one which is still kind of in early development. Moving on to Wi-Fi, I would say the Mio A30 is the best because this one has it right out of the gate with both PlumOS and the stock operating system. However, with the TrimUI Smart, only the stock operating system has Wi-Fi, and even then it's a little bit hit and miss. And unfortunately, MinUI, which is what I would recommend for the TrimUI Smart, doesn't support Wi-Fi, and so you're at a bit of a loss. Of course, the other two handhelds don't have any Wi-Fi at all, so you'll have to use a dongle. But if you're willing to live that dongle life, you do have quite a few options in terms of using retro achievements and stuff like that. Now in terms of HDMI or video out, this one is a no-brainer. Only the RG28XX has a port. And then finally, in terms of battery, it's all pretty close other than the TrimUI Smart. This one's only got 1,000 milliamp hours compared to the others that are somewhere between 2,600 and 3,100 milliamp hours. In general, I would say for the TrimUI Smart, you'll get between 2 and 4 hours of gameplay depending on what you're playing. But the other handhelds will give you at least 4 up to 6 hours of gameplay, and then even up to 8 hours with the RG28XX. And so in looking at this chart and all the context here, it's kind of funny because none of these are a clear winner. But it is surprising that the handheld that got the most best tags is the Mini M. However, just bear in mind that there are some categories, and some of them are very important, where it actually does not do very well. And so when it comes down to it, I think that the XU Mini M is an excellent little handheld. But it is not one that I could recommend for casual users. And that's because, at least as far as me looking at the tea leaves, I don't think this device is going to be around much longer in its current state. It does seem to be that they're going to have a Plus model here coming soon, which will have a new chipset and obviously new operating system as well. And so when you put that all together, it feels like the XU Mini M is made for hobbyists like me. If you're the type of person who likes to tinker around with settings and see what kind of things the community will come up with, then I do think there's a lot of fun to be had with the Mini M. However, if you're just looking to buy something that's very simple and easy to pick up and play, then I don't think this is going to be a good fit. Instead, I think that the other 3 options are probably going to be a better bet in that regard. My biggest hope is that with this device, the company is going to watch this video and they're going to see some of the things that I think could be improved upon and then improve it on the Plus model that should be coming out here soon. Because there are some really killer features with the Mini M, including just the overall feel of it. This is a handheld I've really enjoyed playing over the past several days. And I think that if the D-pad gets improved or the analog sticks stick out just a little bit more, it's going to be an even better experience with the new model as it comes out. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick up this device? Have you already picked up one, or do you think that your $40 to $50 is better spent somewhere else? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.